A couple of things. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Right. And my apology for the washed outness of the slides. This is an interesting room for showing slides. On the upside you can see me. She cried, struggling to get her glasses out. So the reason I chose, this is a reading from the memoir that's coming out in a few months called Golden Girl. And the reason that I chose this section is that my understanding of injustice started from my earliest years when I was a very small child. After I do the reading, hoping that there's time, I want to say a few words about one of the finest social justice warriors I've ever known, Marka Bristow, who just announced her retirement from Access Living yesterday. And Marka is one of the most important people in the history of disability rights in America. And I'm going to try and read quickly so I can talk a little bit about Marka before we go on. All right. Wasn't there a table? I have lost the furniture. So, September 1963. The three of us were wedged into the front seat of Grandma's Pontiac as we drove south on Reading Road. It had finally arrived, my first day of school. So why did it look like we were on our way to Children's Hospital? Mom claimed that that wasn't where we were heading, but I knew that journey all too well. We got to an intersection of Burnett Road where all the hospitals were lined up like Monopoly hotels, but instead of turning right, Grandma signaled left onto Rockdale, and we pulled the car over in front of a big white building. Definitely not the hospital. I craned my neck to read the silver letters over the entrance. The Randall J. Condon School. Imagine if there's an echo chamber. Mom took my right hand, Grandma took my left, and up the steps we went. We checked in with the principal first. I'd never seen anyone like Mr. Hofter. He was so tall that his head occupied the next floor up. Mom signed a stack of paperwork, then it was off to the nurse's office. The nurse wore a white uniform, exactly like in the hospital, and she took my bag of medical supplies and set it inside a medicine chest that had shelves that went all the way to the ceiling. I spotted beds in the next room, and most of the kids out in the hallway were in wheelchairs or on crutches, and I thought, this place sure looked like a hospital to me. The nurse said that kindergarten was downstairs. The elevator had a brass gate that went squeak, just like in a monster movie. And when we got to the basement, it sounded like there was a parade in full swing at the end of the hall. We followed the noise, and there was the kindergarten annex. I stared open-mouthed at a scene of magnificent chaos. The annex was swirling with kids in wheelchairs and crutches, but unlike at Children's Hospital, these kids weren't sick. They were as energetic as any other bunch of junior demons. Boys and girls zipped all over the room and a wheelchair demolition derby, while others crutched at remarkable speed, considering the wingspan of 5-year-old arms. It was a giant pinball game that was played by rhesus monkeys. I was startled to see that two pairs of blue eyes were regarding me from inside the rumpus. The first pair belonged to a round-faced boy whose coppery hair bristled above a sky full of freckles. His crutches were splayed sideways like pardon me, I have not had enough coffee. His crutches are splayed sideways like the legs of a day-old fawn. But it was the second pair of eyes that really demanded my attention. They were very big and very blue, magnified behind lenses thick as family Bibles. The girl had hair the color of autumn leaves, with poofy bangs that spoke of first aid tussles with a curling iron. Tall and skinny and pressed against the fireplace, she jerked her head in my direction. "Get over here, you dingbat, before they mow you down." I looked back. Mom and Grandma were sidling out the door. I shrugged and launched myself into anarchy. Brief description of where we were. Condon School opened in 1928 as the, quote, Cincinnati School for Crippled Children, happily later renamed for the Superintendent of Schools. Randall Condon had what was at the time a radical philosophy, that disabled children should receive a standard academic education. Most schools for disabled children were simply residential warehouses that at most provided minimal vocational training. Alas, when I enrolled in 1963, education for the disabled still qualified as progressive pedagogy. The architectural style of Condon might be called Spanish colonial convalescent. 3 stories of cream yellow stucco that combined modernist simplicity with an unhinged level of ornamentation. Above the gates hung enormous medallions of women, nurses, teachers, saints, who could say, part of a cornice line of griffins, globes, books, flags, frowny heads, and remarkably, fat cherubs brandishing scissors. It seems that flying the scissors is perfectly fine. Inside, fairy tales roamed the halls. A WPA painting of Red Riding Hood stood guard over the library door. The drinking fountain depicted the Pied Piper playing his shawm for a small and blank-faced boy. Condon School was decorated with pictures of children in danger. But it was the square footage of medicalized space that proved that ours was indeed a, quote, special school. Condon boasted an extensive nurse's suite, complete with doctor's office, dentist office, pharmacy, exam rooms, and 5, count them 5, curtained sick beds. Even the outside of the building was medical, with a row of balconies that were constructed for some of its original students, children with tuberculosis, who were wheeled out to breathe the fresh air circulating above the parking lot. Delegations of doctors came through to treat us, observe us, and assess us. It wasn't always clear whether we were being seen for our needs or theirs. Those doctors enrolled me in several longitudinal studies during my years at Condon. Studies run by earnest, lab-coated researchers who smiled like it was part of their training, who blurred the line between school and hospital, a distinction that disappeared several times a day when the nurse came to class with his little paper cups full of medication. And like in the hospital, we had physical therapy every day on high wooden treatment tables that loomed above a floor full of mats and exercise equipment that looked like toys. And trust me, they weren't. We were taught all the usual, math, history, English, etc. And on the other hand, we also had physical therapy, psychotherapy, speech therapy, audiology, and occupational therapy. If it included the word therapy, we had it. Educators came from all over the world to observe our classrooms. Condon was so very odd, so unusual. Cadres of strangers came and stood in the back of the room. They carried notebooks and clipboards, and they watched, and they whispered, and sometimes those whispers came from as far away as Japan. But back to that fireplace. The blue-eyed girl watched my progress as I forded the wild river. I made it to her side and found that she towered over me, a sapling to my shrub. "Hi," she piped. "What's your name?" My name's Reva." She gestured airily towards the pandemonium. "Aren't they such babies? It's like they've never left home before. I'd be embarrassed to act so silly, wouldn't you?" I was impressed. This girl was sophisticated. She said her name was Julie, but really, my name is Juliana, and when I'm a famous singer, I will make sure everybody says Juliana. Don't you think that's prettier? Before I could answer, our teacher, Miss Woodbridge, called out, "Children, take your seats." She asked what we like to do best. Eat ice cream, play house, watch TV, ride my trike. And then, next up, flashcards. But I already knew how to read, so I only snapped to attention when she opened the art cabinets. I managed to impress Julie with my painting of a basket of kittens. It was good to know I had something to offer this friendship. I followed Julie's willowy beacon into every new grade. Everything about her was glamorous. Even her disability, juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, was glamorous because she received gold shots, real gold, directly into her joints. And this only added to her luster. I mean, who else had a condition that was treated with actual precious metals? In 1968, Julie decked herself in peace sign necklaces and bell-bottoms so encrusted with patches and embroidery that they qualified as light armor. We competed to grow our hair long, like Lori Partridge. You are so young, you have no idea what I'm talking about. Just a bit too depressing. Julie got me to nudge my parents for guitar lessons, even though, unlike her, there was no sign I had talent. I was defeated by the tuning fork. So the art room was the only place where I could be leader, not follower. Julie and I, we weren't just friends. We were best friends with a psychic connection. We took to calling each other on the phone every night and enacting the same ritual. The callee would snatch up the receiver and cry, "I knew it was you," as if dialing each other was a surpassingly rare event. Now, all of us, every child at Condon was a little medical monster, constructed by doctors who wrote down our diagnoses on prescription pads and forced those names into our mouths. We breathed around gags made of paper, scrawled with our alphabet: chondroplasia, cerebral palsy, cystic fibrosis, Down syndrome, epilepsy, microcephaly, muscular dystrophy, osteogenesis imperfecta and phocomelia and poliomyelitis, progeria, and spina bifida. But really, though, I can only guess because we seldom talked about them with each other. Adults spent so much time discussing our bodies that we learned each other's names by osmosis. We were kids being kids, making friends, fighting enemies, forming cliques, and having crushes and breaking up, and we liked each other and we didn't. But friendships were not based on shared disabilities. There was no team spina bifida waiting for my membership dues. We were messed up the way kids were, but not the way outcasts were until the end of the school day, when we got back on the bus and turned back into the freaks. One day around the start of 5th grade, Julie and I were heading down the steps when she stopped and seized my arm. "Wait," she breathed, "stay right there. There's something I've been meaning to show you." I frowned. "I don't see anything unusual. Is there something I'm missing?" "Yeah, just walk down one more step and one more, and okay, stop. You feel anything weird?" It's really cold. It's almost freezing." She pointed, "Go back up the landing," and I walked up and down as Julie demonstrated that the cold was confined to a 3-step section. Top of the landing, warm. 2 steps down, meat locker. I shrugged. I guess it's because the building's so old and the window, look, that one's cracked, and no, don't you get it? This is a cold spot. A cold spot is what happens when somebody dies. She drew in a breath. "We just walked straight through a ghost." And then she insisted that we sit in the middle of the cold spot while she recited every story she'd ever heard about kids who died at Condon. Turned out, there was quite a list. So, a long time ago, this kid lost control of his wheelchair and he rolled down the stairs. And Amy told me about this girl who had a seizure and she fell off the 3rd-floor balcony. And Tom said a boy drowned in the swimming pool. And when? When what? Did they, I don't know, like 100 years ago? What Julie didn't say was that we all knew kids who had died. Our first friend to die was Janie, thin and agile and lemur-eyed, 2nd grade, heart disease. There were kids we knew and kids we'd just seen around, kids like Jimmy and Diana, Kids who'd gone into the hospital on a one-way ticket. Neither Julie nor I said their names as we paced the cold spot. It was easier to imagine an icy child from a distant long ago. None of the adults at school ever talked to us about our disappeared friends. No grief counselors reassured us that we were not next. Death was our private child's knowledge. Now, around the end of 5th grade, a morning came when Grandma dropped me at school so early that the sky was still pink. There were no buses in the parking lot, just a smattering of cars. So I settled in to wait in the basement hallway. To my left, French doors closed off the cold spot stairway, and the cafeteria lay down in the hall to my right. I sat down in front of the elevators. The gates and the glass doors made it easy to see if anyone was inside. Those elevators had manual controls, so you had to either call them or be inside to make them go. I was deep into a paperback. For anyone over 50, that paperback was Julie Lighten. What's it called? Julie Lighten? Anyway, tragic story of a girl who was addicted. When suddenly both elevators landed right in front of me. Both were empty. This made no sense. And as I watched, they moved up to the 3rd floor and then down to the basement, still empty, still without my doing a thing. I was pretty sure that elevators were not supposed to have a mind of their own, so I stood up to find a maintenance man. And that's when something flickered at the corner of my eye. A milky fog was filling the hallway. The French doors disappeared behind a cloud of, was it smoke? There was no smell, but that made sense of the weirdness. Oh shit, I thought, school's on fire. And I got up to run. And the cloud contracted and shrank to nothing. And in its place was the faint shape of a little boy. He was dim, like a slide projected through a sheet. I could see dark hair, light blue shirt, darker pants. His hands and face were only pale, blurry blobs. What mattered was that I could see the French doors right through his body, and that he was floating 6 inches above the floor. The boy was 15 or 20 feet away when he began to drift in my direction. I was terrified that he was going to talk to me, and he didn't, at least nothing I could hear. He just drifted closer and closer and vanished. No boy, no mist, no fire, but the sound of small, hard-soled shoes ran straight at me. Kerslap, and I flattened against the wall. The banister gouged my spine, and just as he seemed close enough to touch me, his shoes clattered past and headed for the cafeteria, and I bolted for the parking lot, where, thank God, the first buses were coming in. When Julie stepped off, I dragged her to the bushes. I was crying and shaking, but she made me tell it over and over, obviously startled that it happened to me. I mean, after all, Julie was our seance medium, the only one who could intone, "Oh, spirits speak," without convulsing into giggles. The ghost made a final appearance the day of our 8th grade graduation. The auditorium had a wide stage with heavy red velvet curtains front and back. We graduates were arrayed in a line facing the audience. Hello, audience. I was sitting between Amy and Donald, singing our farewell song, when somebody smacked me on the shoulder. And I hissed at Donnie, "Why the heck did you hit me?" He glared back, "You're crazy, you hit me." Our teacher pressed a finger to his lips, so we shut up. After the ceremony, our family swarmed the stage, so it wasn't until the cookies and lemonade reception that I found out that every single kid on stage had felt somebody slap or punch them. We had been thumped in full view of the audience, and yet all they saw was the red velvet curtain rippling as if in a high wind. I'm not sad for the Condon ghost. I understand not wanting to leave the one place where you feel safe. Condon School was its own universe where the rules of normalcy melted away, leaving the door open to the infinite variances of reality. And there at Condon for 9 years, we invented our own way to use our bodies and our minds, and we made a world for ourselves and for each other to replace the one where we were irrelevant, where we had no value. Some of us did hate Condon, could not carry the burden of stigma, of exile. We who longed to be accepted into the mainstream, even if it meant denying every true thing about ourselves. And I had that longing, but more, I needed those 8 hours a day when I was a golem among golems, where I was not the only one of my kind. I could be a monster in a school for the strange, where normal was whatever was real for us. Thank you. That's the great thing about reading glasses. You all disappear and my notes go away. So these are, my career has been actually as a portrait artist who works with people who deal with stigma, as Marlene explained, for various reasons. My work is based on long collaborations where I interview people at length about their lives, and then I take those stories and turn them into narrative portraits. There's an elaborate ethical structure that goes along with them. But rather than talking about my portraits so much, although, please do look, for 6 years I had the honor of working at Access Living, which is a center for independent living here on Chicago Avenue. It was founded, I believe, 30 years ago, something like that, by Marco Bristow and several other people, including some of the people in these portraits. Marco Bristow is one of the drafters of the Americans with Disabilities Act, of the Convention for the Rights of People with Disabilities through the United Nations. She's on the board of the Ford Foundation. This is a tiny fraction of what she's done to change the lives of people with disabilities. And she has been determined and single-minded. She has learned. She was not born with a disability. She was, I believe when she was in college, she was here at Lake Michigan with a group of friends, and she dived off the rocks and broke her neck. And this was at a time that there was almost no disability rights movement. And here at what used to be the Rehabilitation Institute, a group of people who had similarly all acquired their disabilities got together and started to talk because they went into shock. They had been people who had been privileged to have mainstream lives, who were used to having a certain level of fluidity and jobs and relationships, and then they ended up with significant impairments, and it all went away. They couldn't get on a bus, they couldn't get in a taxi, they didn't have cars, they couldn't get around, there were no curb cuts, there were no rights, no laws, no nothing. And so they got together, and based on the anti-war movement and the women's movement and the civil rights movement, they took a lot of those principles of how to fight for what you lack. And they started the Chicago Center of Disability Rights. This was a movement that had started in Berkeley with the 504 sit-ins, which is a whole long story. I recommend looking up drunk history, the 504 section, which is fabulous. But it became national and then international, and then my entree was into disability culture, which is the arts branch of the rights movement. But Marka has, as of yesterday, as I said, she has retired from Access Living. It is a huge loss, but at the same time, she has trained 2 generations of fierce activists. It's recognized the fact that impairment goes into every community, every age, all ethnicities, all races, every socioeconomic category, and it's one of those things that really has brought people together. So anyway, I'm going to stop talking now. I saw a hand go up by Marlene.